Okay, welcome back, drummers. This is part two in my guide on learning to read and write drum notation. Hopefully everyone's had a bit of a chance to look through lesson one and learned about quarter notes and quarter note rests and how they appear as notation. Today we're going to be looking at the staff. Now this is just as vital as what we did in lesson one, so I'm going to take it slow and we're going to use, once again, these real life comparison slash examples where we can. All right, so hopefully you've all gained an understanding of lesson one and all the parts that were presented in lesson one. If you don't, it might be good to go back, just have a bit of a recap so that you understand some of the points that I'm going to be putting forward in today's lesson. And today the aim is to talk about the staff and talk about what it's all about, how does it look, what's it all for, and you should be able to identify all the parts of our drum set as written on the staff. Okay. I also want to point out that I will be referring to this book that you see pictured here. This is a guide to standard drum set notation. I bought this book a couple of years ago, and it's actually been a very good source for double checking my work and also for sort of teaching other students to learn to read music. One of the problems that drummers have always had is there hasn't really been a standard when it comes to writing drum music. And because of this, people have sort of written things their own way, and you'll find that, where a hi-hat might be written one way in some piece of music, somebody else has written it completely differently in their piece of music. And you can put what they call a key at the top of, they sometimes call it a legend, at the top of a piece of music that will show you what parts of the kit are meant to be where. But I think the standard now is starting to become the norm. The reason I've picked this book is because it's PASS approved, the Percussive Art Society, and these guys are very active in print media and writing music. So if these guys are going to keep producing books and releasing books, I want to be working by their standard. I think it's probably a good habit to get into, and it will eliminate the need to always have this key or this legend at the top of the piece of music. So I think if we can teach everybody the same way from this point, we're more inclined to start developing a standard for how drum music is written. Also, the book covers all parts of the kits, and as far as books go, it's actually quite modern. I know it says they're 1998, but when you consider some of the go-to instructional books like Syncopation and Stick Control and Accents and Rebounds and all those sorts of books, they were written in sort of like the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. So 1998, comparatively, is very modern when it comes to books. All right, so moving on, if I can move on, here we go. There we go, the staff. All right, so the staff itself is really the lines that which we write all music on. It's no different to how we would see a notepad, for example, having lines on a page for us to write our words. So there's that comparison again. So just like lines exist on note paper to give us something to write on, the staff is the lines that we write our music on. All right. But because all music is written on this staff, we need to know when we're looking at a piece of drum music and not, for example, a piece of music written for trumpet or for piano or for bass guitar or etc. etc. So you get the idea. Now, they use what they call a clef. Okay, and a clef is a symbol that is placed at the beginning of the music, which will tell you what instrument or instruments this piece of music that you're going to read is meant to be for. Okay, so there are four clefs that are commonly used in notation. You've probably heard of some of them: treble clef, bass clef, alto clef, and tenor clef, and that's what they look like. So some of those may be familiar to you already. And what the clef actually indicates is the pitch, what certain pitches are going to be called when we read this piece of music that's coming up. Unfortunately, with drums, we don't really deal with pitch so much, whereas on a guitar or a trumpet, you can sort of go up the scale and you'll see the notes getting higher and higher and higher in pitch. The treble, bass, alto, and tenor clef will tell us what those pitches are as a piece of music. But with drums, because we don't really have pitch per se, in actual fact, none of those clefs are really appropriate for how we read music. So fortunately, there is another clef which is actually less common, but for us, it's the way we're going to be seeing anything. It's called neutral clef. And there's two ways to write neutral clef, but what you need to know from this is, on all of our music from now on, when we see the staff, the series of 5 lines, we look at the symbol that's placed at the beginning of those of that staff, and it should be one of these two ways. All right, so Whether you're using the symbol on the left or the symbol on the right, the point to take here is they both indicate neutral clef. I don't want to confuse things any more than I have to, so we're going to be using the one on the left. Okay, so now whenever you see a piece of music, let's have a bit of a look here. Here we go. So here's a blank sheet of music, and you can see on the left there those two vertical lines to indicate neutral clef. This is not intended for an instrument where pitch has any sense of relevance. So for us, perfect for drums. So we're going to write all our music in neutral clef. Okay. Recap. Notice the staff. Okay, we know what the staff is. That's the 5 lines that we see. We know what the clef is. We know what bar lines are, and we should know what measures are because we did all that in the first example. So if you're looking at that piece of music there, albeit blank, and you can understand what you're seeing, fantastic. We're ready to move on. All right, so a page of music, here it is. So what do we know about what we see? Well, a couple of things. We can see that there's a whole bunch of quarter notes on there. There's a whole bunch of quarter note rests. We should be able to see bar lines. We should know about measures and how there's 4 notes in a measure or rests in a measure. We now understand these 2 vertical lines here. We know that that's neutral clef. So there's a couple of things that we don't really understand yet. So let's have a quick look at them, but I'm just going to gloss over them because they're not going to be important for today's lesson. All right, so we've got this these 2 4s here. Okay. Now, if you don't know what that means, don't stress out. Here's a quick explanation. That's the time signature. Okay, that tells us how we're supposed to count music, and as it's pointed out there, we're going to do more on that later. But that gives the reader an indication of how we're supposed to count the music that's coming up. All right, now also this section that you see here, this quarter note with a little number written next to it, this is a tempo. It's a tempo marking, and much in the same way that a time signature tells us how we're supposed to count, the tempo marking tells us how fast we're meant to count and what kinds of notes we're supposed to be counting as our main count. Again, more on this later. This shouldn't make a whole lot of sense right now. It's not urgent. Okay? But what we should know is that the 4 quarter notes that we see in the first measure are all snare drums. Now, you can tell straight away that the snare drums all sit in this position sort of between the 2nd and 3rd line on the staff, right? I'm here to tell you now that that's always where snare drums are going to be. So if you look at your 5 lines and you see a note placed between the 2nd and the 3rd line from the top, that's going to be a snare drum. Okay, so try and remember that. That's the first thing we're going to have to remember from today. All right, so if we go back to our previous example, we can see that all of those notes there are either rests or notes being played on the snare drum. And I'm just pointing out now that we can have those stems pointing up or down. Right, we learned this in the previous lesson. It doesn't really matter. The reason you would do it one way or another is really for clarity. As we start adding more notes, it's going to be perhaps difficult to read things one way versus another. So for this example, I've put the stems both down and up, and it should be equally as easy to read one way or another. Okay, so we're being told here that the tempo is 120, the time signature is 4/4, we're in neutral clef, and we're playing a whole bunch of snare drums. All right, now if you're really clever, you've probably also figured out that that piece of music contains 16 measures or 16 bars, and yeah, consists of rests and of notes. All right, but what about everything else? The snare drum's all well and good, but part of the reason we're starting to write everything on 5 lines now is that we can start fitting in other parts of the drum set. Okay, so there's the snare drum. Sits between the 2nd and 3rd line from the top of the staff. We're already familiar with that one. Moving on, kick drum. Now have a look at that one. So that's between the 4th and the 5th, or in between the bottom 2 lines of the staff. Tom 1, between the 1st and 2nd lines from the top. Tom 2 goes through the 2nd line from the top. All right. Now, if you've had any experience reading other music or playing other instruments, these notes would actually be given pitches. That, for example, would be called a D in treble clef. I'm deliberately not using that because, of course, as we note with neutral clef, there is no relevance to pitch. Okay, the parts of our kit are literally given positions on that staff, and that's it. Moving on, floor tom, in the space between the 3rd and 4th lines from the top of the staff. Cymbals are a little bit different. So although we see these solid, just to go back a touch, you can see here that we've got a nice solid note head. That's all well and good for drums, but for cymbals we do things a little bit differently. We're going to denote cymbals by using a diagonal cross, as you see there. So here's our hi-hats. They sit on the top line. Simple enough. So you would read them the same way as you would read the floor toms, but when you see a cross, you should be getting the notion that this is going to be a cymbal we're playing, not a drum. Okay. Similarly, we get to a ride cymbal, goes between the first and second lines from the top of the staff. A crash cymbal, okay, that's actually incorrect for the crash cymbal. It's supposed to sit through, there we go, that's, all right, so it's meant to sit through the line here. So it sits one line above the staff. Now, if you had to, you don't see it here, but those lines can actually continue above and below. So when we want to place a note somewhere that intersects or sits between one of these imaginary lines, we put in a section of the line, okay, so that we can see, oh, okay, there should be a line there and our note is going through it. So that's actually a cross sitting through a line that we don't draw all of because it's above where the sort of standard staff should be. You'll see more of this later, so don't get too confused, but that's not an asterisk or a star that you're seeing there. It's actually a cross sitting through an imaginary line that sits on top of our staff. All right, so let's have a quick look. So the first measure, we've got all snare drums. The second measure is kick drums, then toms, then the second tom and floor tom. Okay, note the direction of the stems here. The stems are pointing downwards in some examples and up in others. That's really just to keep the stems inside the staff. Again, it's for clarity, it's for ease of reading. This rule, and I'll use the word rule loosely, won't always hold. Okay, so don't worry too much about the directions of the stems. They are kind of meaningless at the moment, but what you do need to take from this is the positions that you're seeing these instruments in and how they're being notated, whether it's with a solid note as drums would be, or whether it's with a cross as cymbals would be noted. Okay, or another way to look at this, so this is a little bit more visual now. All right, so those 8 parts of the kit that you see, that's what we need to learn from today. We know that the staff consists of 5 lines. We know that all of our music is written with a staff denoted by neutral clef. In other words, the notes that we're going to see don't have any pitch value, but this is where they're all going to be laid out on our staff. So right away, if you've got a 5-piece kit, you should be able to start putting some quarter notes into our staff. Now, note, for a lot of this, I haven't used stems. I just want to remove the stems because, as I said before, they're kind of pointless at the moment. But when we're counting music, 1, 2, 3, 4, if we're going to start putting these notes on our staff, then they absolutely do have to have those quarter note stems because otherwise they're not quarter notes. All right, so let's look at a piece of music now. Now, this is beyond what we should know at the moment, but some of this should start making sense. All right, so this is by Fall Out Boy, Sugar We're Going Down. I don't know the song personally, but we start seeing some things that are familiar. First of all, we can see that it's written in neutral clef. Okay, that tells me that these notes have nothing to do with pitch. These notes are to do with something else. Now, we also know that it's drums that we're playing, so this is great. This means that it's a piece of music that is appropriate for drummers, i.e. us. All right, so we do know a couple of things here. We know here that this is a hi-hat. We know that this is a kick drum. We know that this is a snare drum because they use these locations. Hi-hat, snare drum. All right, so although we don't know everything about that piece of music, we do know a few things. We also know that this is crash all through here. We're playing crashes. All right. We also know that this is a quarter note. It's a quarter note on the hi-hat. Forget that little circle above. We'll get to that later. You know, we know that these are all kick drums in here. We know that that's a snare drum. So already, even though we can't read this, we can start seeing some familiar pieces to this music. And as we learn more, you're going to be able to identify a whole lot more and eventually be able to read it and play it. Okay, this is quite a complex piece of music, by the way. All right, so that's actually all I wanted you to show you for today. Go back through this exercise, have a look at the staff. I want everybody to have a go at maybe drawing some quarter notes on a staff, picking out the different parts of your kit, and maybe just starting to write a little piece of music that maybe starts with a kick drum, then a snare drum, then a hi-hat, then a tom. You know, that's the 4 quarter notes in our bar, so then we close it, we start a new bar or measure, write 4 more parts of your kit in there. Let's start writing as though it's a piece of music. And once again, if you have any questions about anything that you've seen today regarding where the parts of the drums go, and you know, how the staff is meant to be laid out, and what the neutral clef is and what it does, please shoot me those lessons in either messages below or in private messages, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you when lesson 3 is released.